Hey nerds, what's up? Today we're going to try to answer the question, does budget equal quality? We're going to look at some data after the jump. So the other day I was watching Q and TG's newest fantasy news video they're doing, and I'll link that video in the comments, but I was watching it and they were talking about the budget for the new season of the Lord of the Rings TV show that Amazon is producing. And the budget is $465 million for a single season of a TV show. To put some perspective on that, that is 5 times the money that the final season of Game of Thrones was given. Like the huge, culturally relevant, hugely successful Game of Thrones finale. And it's starting to feel like to me that budget is becoming a competition. It's look how much money we can spend on this new adaptation or this new TV show. And there's some sort of insinuation there, look at our budget. You know this show is going to be amazing. But the question is that true? Does having a bigger budget automatically mean that something's gonna be of higher quality, or that fans are going to like it a lot, or audiences are going to respond to it? And can we even answer this sort of question somewhat objectively? Well, I'm gonna try today. I decided to do research on 43 book-to-movie adaptations across 16 different franchises. And if you're interested to see what those are, I will list them in the comment box below. But what I did is I took all of those fantasy book-to-movie adaptations and I found out what their budget was. I want to be clear that I specifically looked at fantasy book-to-movie adaptations, which narrowed down my search quite a bit. I also started to look at TV shows to put them in a different category and kind of research budgets on those, but I ran into several problems, the biggest of it being that for whatever reason, movie budgets are well known and advertised, but TV budgets often are hushed. There were so many TV shows that I looked up where articles would specifically state they have not released budget information. So I don't know why that is or what that's about, but ultimately I ran into too many problems with that and my data set was too small, so I'm skipping TV shows and just focusing on movie adaptations. So I looked up the budgets for all 43 of these movies and I recorded them, and then I used an inflation calculator to make all of the budgets equal to 2021 dollars. Now I know this isn't a perfect way to do it, but I think it's the best way we have of comparing budgets over decades of movies. I think my earliest movie is sometime in the 70s, which is a huge budgetary difference from movies that are produced in 2014. So just putting them all up to 2021, I think is the best way we have to kind of even the playing field there. Once I had budget down, I then looked into ways to quantify quality. And the two things I mostly thought of were audience reception and money made by the franchise. So I first went to Rotten Tomatoes and decided to record the critic score and the audience score for each of these movies. Now, I know using Rotten Tomatoes isn't perfect for a lot of reasons. One, there is no released data on how exactly Rotten Tomatoes gets their scores that they put as critic and audience ratings, so we don't really know what goes into it. Additionally, we don't know anything about the demographic of this population who's voting on Rotten Tomatoes. We don't know their age groups or their gender or their socioeconomic status or their geographical location, and all of those things can make a big difference when we talk about things like this. Additionally, there's this kind of hidden variable of the fact that people who go online to record how they liked a movie are fundamentally different often than people who don't. So I recognize all those problems, but this is the only data we have, so we're going with it, and I want to do this thing. So we're using Rotten Tomatoes to record critic and audience score. Of course, the other thing this doesn't take into account is the difference between general audiences and book fans, which I know is more important to us, but I have no way of quantifying book fan versus regular fan of a movie, so this is what we're going with. I also calculated something that I called an earnings rating, which was just the global gross of a movie divided by its budget. I did this to try to get an idea of how much money a movie made back, 1, 2, 3, up to 10 times the budget it used, as kind of a measure of success. And finally, just for fun, I made what I call an aggregate score, which basically evenly averaged out the critic, audience, and budget score for all of the movies into one single number. So ultimately, I have 4 measures of quality. I have a critic score, an audience score, an earnings ratio, and an aggregate score of all of those. And I plotted them all against budget. Now, if we get the results we would expect from what it seems like showrunners think, the higher the budget would mean better reception, higher quality. So let's see if that's actually what the data said. Now, I also want to mention that I calculated an R² value for all of these scatter plots that you're about to see. And for those of you who aren't super into stats, basically an R² value tells you how perfectly your data are correlated. So for example, data that falls into a perfect line would be an R² value of 1, meaning this line is a perfect representation of your data. So data with large trends have a higher R² number that's closer to 1, and data that has a bad trend or doesn't really show us anything as related to each other are going to have low R² values. So basically this is just a numerical way for us to see how well budget really predicts any of these quality indicators that I've chosen, like critic score or audience score. So sorry, without further ado, let's get into the data. Okay, first I'm throwing up the charts for critic score versus budget and audience score versus budget. Now, if we look at these, we see that the plots are all over the place and we have tiny R² values. Like from these charts, budget is not predicting critic or audience reception at all. The budget doesn't really matter, essentially, is what these graphs are showing us. It just, whether you have a small budget or a large budget, a critic score, an audience score could be high or low. We're not predicting anything. Now there's some other trends I kind of see in this chart, but I'm gonna wait till the end until we've seen all the charts before I talk about that. Hilariously, when we look at budget versus earnings, it has a negative trend line. I mean, it's a low R² value, so it's not like very good, but it's slightly negative, implying that the more budget you spend, the less you're gonna make on a movie. Now, this for some reason made me laugh at first, like, oh, the more you spend, the worse your movie's gonna do. Obviously, that's not exactly what it's saying. There's a clear like variable here that makes sense, which is the more you spend on a movie, the harder it'll be to make the money back, right? The harder you have to climb, the more audience you need to gain. But either way, it's not predicting anything. Like our budget we spend isn't predicting how much money we're necessarily gonna make back. It's just all over the place. Finally, we have our aggregate score, which is the average of all of those scores I talked about, which is our earnings ratio, our audience score, and our critic score against budget. Despite all of them being very bad trends that we've seen previously, this one is by far the worst and is reflected in our crazy low R² value. Perhaps it's like a slightly positive trend, but basically a random scatter plot. This honestly doesn't surprise me, as there are certain cases where the audience and critic score vary widely. So once we average them together, it's gonna make our scatter plot even more hectic and less likely to predict anything. So let's dig a little deeper into this data. Now, all the plots look pretty similar, so I'm gonna focus on audience score versus budget and critic score versus budget, since they're the ones I'm kind of the most interested in. So I'm gonna throw those back up here and show you some interesting things I noticed. First, we need to talk about an outlier that's in every single one of these plots and that I almost deleted, but in the end decided to keep on. And that data point is the Princess Bride. The Princess Bride is different than a lot of these fantasy adaptations for several reasons. First, it had a crazy low budget, but like it also didn't have a ton of fantasy elements that needed budget. Obviously, the Princess Bride is fantasy, but it's not like Lord of the Rings or Harry Potter, where there's a lot of magic going on and a lot of things that can't be done physically. The Princess Bride's brand of fantasy doesn't involve like lots of costuming or CGI, so it could use that smaller budget. They didn't really need a big budget. Additionally, the author of the book literally wrote the screenplay and had already won Academy Awards for screenwriting, which is just like such an unusual thing. Like that's just so unusual that would ever happen. So it's not surprising that this data point is very odd, that it is very low on the budget and very critically and audience acclaimed. The other more interesting thing I want to point out is that between 100 and 150 million seems to be our budget spot. Notice how many data points fall in here and in that range, and they go from the highest and lowest of quality ratings. Now, obviously I know this data I collected isn't a science, but I do find it interesting that between 100 and 150 million seems to be like the fantasy budget. That seems to be the budget that we can make quality movies on. It's the budget that has enough for us to do the CGI we need, to make the magic, to make the elves and the orcs or whatever it is, and make a quality movie. But what's so interesting about that the most of the data points fall in that budget, is it also has the widest amount of critic and audience range, like the acclaim range. It goes from the very lowest of lowest scores to the very highest of highest scores, which kind of implies that your budget doesn't make the movie, right? And are we surprised? honestly, I'm not very surprised. Going into this, I kind of thought that budget would be a bad indicator of success, but I honestly didn't think it was going to be this bad. I thought there would be a little bit of skew towards bigger budget things having higher quality, only because I thought that there was this hidden variable about how things that get bigger budgets are more likely to already be popular, right? So Harry Potter was going to get a big budget because it was pretty well known that it was going to be decently successful. Same with maybe Lord of the Rings. Like, there are some things that people maybe are more willing to put more budget in. So I was actually surprised at how little of a trend there was towards bigger budget means bigger reception. But I think we've kind of known all along that budget isn't the only thing a fantasy adaptation needs. Sure, we do need a big enough budget so maybe some of the magic and the world building isn't cheesy, but I think beyond the cheesy factor, there's like so much more than just that goes into it. What makes a fantasy adaptation quality? I think maybe we're just not throwing our money at the right things. Is throwing money at making bigger and better fight scenes and battles and I don't know what else they use that money for in the CGI really what makes it like a movie stand out to us? Of course those scenes are good. Like, I mean, let's compare A New Hope and The Force Awakens. I think we all feel like the original trilogy of Star Wars was the most successful. This isn't a book to movie adaptation, but we're just gonna talk about it because it's easy. Like, when you see the laughable difference of budget even after being adjusted, and you think of the difference in the reception, sure, was it amazing to watch some of those awesome cinematic scenes in The Force Awakens? Yes. But ultimately, is that what is gonna keep a movie like stuck in our minds and our zeitgeist and in our hearts? No, I don't think so. Like, this is just my opinion, but I think maybe if we threw a little bit more money at like acting and screenwriting and maybe getting some, I don't know, experts in there on how to really adapt a book to movie, like maybe that would be money well spent. Like, when we think of the success of Princess Bride, even though I know it's a little bit different because again, it didn't need that budget, like, do we remember Princess Bride for the costuming or the setting? No. Princess Bride is iconic because of the line delivery and just the lines in that movie. I mean, it's iconic for that reason. I mean, even think about the Lord of the Rings. Like, maybe I'm wrong on this, but when we think of Lord of the Rings, are we often talking about like these sweeping battle scenes as being like so incredible? Like, they were good. Like, yes, there were some really cool cinematic moments in the Lord of the Rings trilogy, but a lot of that movie's success, I think, comes down to the fact that they just did an excellent job of knowing what to choose to take out of the books and put into the movie. They knew exactly what to take and exactly what to leave. And even though I've made a video about how I loved everything in the book, I think they just did an excellent job of getting the feel of the book, right? That's what made it successful. And of course, in my opinion, like, impeccable casting. Like, that's what made those movies work. If we, didn't have that, would the CGI scenes be enough? And my argument is no, they wouldn't be. No matter how cinematic or beautiful a movie is, if you don't have the screenplay and the acting to support the heart of the film, it's just not going to do anything. And Lord of the Rings is like such an interesting case because the same director did The Hobbit, which at least most fans that I know found wildly unsuccessful compared to The Lord of the Rings. It was bloated. It had unnecessary additions. Again, these are the things that had to do with the screenplay, not the CGI. So honestly, as I've been seeing these articles come out about these giant budgets for these different fantasy adaptations that are coming out, I kind of roll my eyes. I feel like it's starting to become a weird flex. Like, people want to flex about how much money they're throwing at this, and I don't necessarily think it's going to be a good indicator of quality. I'm going to wait for the work to speak for itself once it's out and once I've seen it. Okay, this video was obviously just for fun, and I know my data is pretty silly and not serious, but I had a ton of fun researching it and finding out all this data. So I definitely want to know what you think. What did you think about the data I found and the plots I did? Like, what do you see in those? Is there anything I missed there or something else you'd like to see me do and research into? I want to know what your feelings are about these bigger and bigger budgets that seems to keep being released, and how do you feel about it? Do you think the budget makes it? Do you feel like the better the graphics, the better the movie? I would really like to know your thoughts. Let me know in the comment section below. And as always, if you like these kind of videos, please like and subscribe. And you can check out what I'm currently reading as well as other fantasy rants on my Instagram at bookborn.reviews. I'll see you next time. Bye. Okay, so if you're still with me, I actually collected some more data that I didn't feel like really fit in the main portion of my video, but I kind of want to share. I decided to try to plot author involvement against some of our audience reception scores to see if it mattered. Now, to keep this consistent, I decided to remove any movies where the author was deceased when they were created. I felt like it wasn't really fair to judge those movies when there wasn't an option to involve the author. This was hard data to come by and was a little subjective, which is why I also didn't include it in the main part of the video. I had to scour through tons of articles and interviews with the authors about their movies and try to determine based on their language how involved they were. In the end, I had a scale that was none, low, medium, high, and then a single point in extremely high just for The Princess Bride, as we described earlier, being an outlier. But I tried to use their own language to determine like how involved they were. None would be like none at all. Low would be like, I was allowed on set, but I couldn't make any decisions. Medium tended to fall around, they took some of my advice when I told them. High is like, I was there every day. I was making casting decisions. I was helping with the script. That would be like a J.K. Rowling sort of thing. Either way, I found the results kind of interesting. I don't think they can tell us much simply for how subjective and small the sample size is, but it does have our highest R-squared value, indicating that a larger author involvement in the project often means a better reception of the adaptation, which I thought was kind of interesting and something I thought would be true. But again, this data could be just confirming my own bias about the situation. I am interested to know what your opinion is on this data though, if you're watching this. Like, if you think that matters, I'm kind of inclined to think it does, but again, you know, who knows?